Hi, welcome to Decolonization in Asia, Module 4.1, the Indochina Wars. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the First and Second Indochina Wars. The first is Vietnamese communists and nationalist forces fighting against the French in the wake of World War II when the French tried to retake their former colony. The Second Indochina War is, on the one hand, the United States and the government of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, fighting against a sovereign state in the north, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and an insurgency in the south, the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong. We'll work through the complicated positions of all those parties as we move. There is a third Indochina War, 1978, 79, and low-level conflicts going on until the 90s between largely Vietnam and China. By that point, with U.S. support, China was backing the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Vietnam, at the end of 1978, invaded Cambodia, ending the genocide there. And so China went to started a small border war in northern Vietnam as reprisals. But that war is outside the scope of what we have to talk about today and outside the scope of our class. With that said, let us get into it. I will say two things before I begin. One, the caveat remains that you should assume I am mispronouncing every proper noun in this lecture. And two, this is a lecture where normally, if we were meeting in person, I would have warned you on Blackboard that there's going to be some significant moments of graphic imagery. Since it's a video lecture, you're free to turn your head in private if you can't handle that kind of thing. I know as a new dad, I always have a lot of trouble building these lectures now. I can't handle pictures of mutilated, dead children's bodies and things like that, like I used to when I was cynical and going to live forever and not a dad. Anyway, with that in mind, let's get into it. So French forces moved on Hanoi in December 1946. Again, they're coming back in after Japanese surrender. The Viet Minh, the fighting force of the Indochinese Communist Party, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam with its capital in Hanoi. In the wake of Japanese surrender, while they were still being occupied by the Kuomintang, the French are back. The French are going to take it over. It's an easier time in the south because that's where Britain handled Japanese surrender. In the north, it was handled by the Kuomintang, who were not excited to have communists on their southern border, but also not excited to have Western imperialists return to control Vietnam either. So Viet Minh troops, December 1946, defended parts of Hanoi as best they could for about 2 months, to enable a withdrawal of the main forces of the Viet Minh into the mountainous countryside west and north of the city. After 6 weeks of assaults, the French retook the old imperial capital at Hue and most of the cities in Tonkin and Annam. You will recall those are the two protectorates in the north and center parts of Vietnam, respectively. While the Viet Minh were outgunned, they had something that the French did not: the broad support of the peasantry and control of rice production in Tonkin's Red River Delta. So they're able to supply themselves, and the peasants are willing to help supply them. Their appeal was based on both a call for Vietnamese independence and their ability to address everyday peasant concerns in the areas they controlled. In the south, the French recruited Emperor Bao Dai to participate in the short-lived State of Vietnam. But this was a half measure in allowing Vietnamese sovereignty, which did little to change the overall war. The war was brutal from the beginning. Fighting was not just between French and Vietnamese, but also between Vietnamese groups themselves, struggling to gain leadership and control over anti-imperialist resistance among the people. In October 1947, French forces launched an assault on Phu To in northern Tonkin. The campaign killed tens of thousands of Viet Minh troops, but failed to capture Ho Chi Minh. French violence worked to the Viet Minh's advantage by creating more anti-French sentiment. By 1949, the Viet Minh Army, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, grew to 250,000 members. And by 1949, the ICP governed half of the Vietnamese population, roughly 12 million people. In late 1949, the Viet Minh gained a huge advantage through the Chinese Communist Party's successful revolution in China. The newly founded People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were some of the earliest states to recognize the legitimacy of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the government in Vietnam. And in January 1950, Vo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh secured military aid agreements from the PRC. This was made possible because while Vo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh were in Beijing, Mao himself was in Moscow, securing economic aid for his own newly formed state. So as soon as Moscow confirmed aid to China, China confirmed aid to Vietnam. You will remember at this time that China, well, not by January 1950, but in the early 1950s, China is also going to go to war with the United States on the Korean Peninsula. We will see in just a second, or you see on your slide now, the level of U.S. aid to French forces in the First Indochina War. If we consider Chinese aid and advice to northern Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, during this war, what we suddenly have is, in fact, two proxy wars to varying extents being fought between the newly formed People's Republic of China and the United States. And in both of those wars, for reasons that have more or less to do with Chinese support, depending on if you're talking about Korea or Vietnam, the U.S. or U.S.-supported side loses. You can see then why, in the end, or the early 1950s, the spread of communism, the spread of the power of the socialist bloc really deeply changes and militarizes United States foreign policy. During 1950, 24,000 POVN regulars trained in one of three camps in China. That same year, POVN forces were able to wipe out most French forces in northern Tonkin, capturing 11,000 tons of ammunition. As the Viet Minh surrounded French-controlled Hanoi, Chinese aid increased from 20 tons per month in 1951 to 1,500 tons per month in March of 1954. What about the other side? At the same time, worried about the spread of communism in Asia, the U.S. began to support the 200,000 French troops in Indochina. Washington delivered during this time, or 1950 and 1951, 5,000 tons of military aid per month. This aid included fighter planes and bombers, which POVN did not have. In a 4-day series of battles around Vinh Yen, French forces killed as many as 6,000 POVN soldiers. By the end of 1952, U.S. military aid to the French included 228 aircraft, 253 naval craft, 13,000 transport vehicles, and 777 armored vehicles. Ngo Dinh Diem, who could not pull Emperor Bao Dai away from his loyalties to the French, left Vietnam in August 1950. He arrived in America that December, where he would stay for the next 4 years, building, along with other members of the Ngo family, especially Ngo Dinh Nhu, a relationship with the U.S. government, and most importantly, a relationship with officials from the CIA. In early 1951, the Indochinese Communist Party held its National Congress in Tonkin, claiming to represent 500,000 total ICP members. On advice from the Chinese Communist Party, the ICP formally split into 3 separate organizations. In Vietnam, you had the Vietnamese Workers' Party, the VWP. In Cambodia, you had the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party. A committee was established with Gaison Phomvihan at its head to establish a similar party in Laos, but that does not actually get done until 1955, 4 years later, and that group becomes the Lao People's Party, better known as the Batet Lao, to the extent that the Batet Lao are known at all. In reality, each of these organizations was still dominated by Vietnamese leadership under figures like Ho Chi Minh, Truong Trinh, Le Duan, Pham Van Dong, and Vo Nguyen Giap. In 1952, the Viet Minh, led by the VWP, began a land reform campaign modeled on the CCP's experience in China and CCP advice. Reforms began with rent reductions and grew to the seizure of land from landlords to be redistributed to poor peasants. Ho authorized the execution of landlords at a rate of 1 in every 1,000 people. In areas around the Red River, 15% of land was redistributed to 20% of the peasantry. Landless workers dropped from 20 to 14% of the population. By 1953, Pavan had roughly 350,000 soldiers, many of whom were stationed within striking distance of Hanoi. The following year, Pavan's forces swelled to roughly 450,000, making them more or less equal in size to French forces in Vietnam. Attempting to cut off connections between communists in Tonkin and Laos, the French dispatched troops to a village in the rural mountains of Tonkin called Dien Bien Phu, near the Lao border. Pavan forces, assisted by local peasant volunteers, dragged heavy artillery from the border with China up into the mountains surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Partially on CCP advice, and at this point the CCP Advisory Committee to Vietnam, led by a man named Wei Guoqing, have become fairly important in sort of teaching guerrilla tactics, encouraging the Viet Minh to continue and helping plan this particular attack. The Viet Minh, on their advice, then began a 2-month-long assault on the French camp, eventually defeating a French garrison of 16,000. On May 7, 1954, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh finally defeated French forces and ended the war. Peace talks began the next day in Geneva, Switzerland. Before we say too much about Geneva, let us look at the where and the why of Dien Bien Phu. So you can see, of course, the red dot on the map. This is the village. This is Dien Bien Phu. You have Hanoi to the east, and to the south, you have the Lao capital of Vientiane. Not pictured to the south, or not labeled here, to the southwest, is the Lao royal capital of Luang Prabang. What was happening, the reason for stationing troops at Dien Bien Phu, is that Viet Minh presence in Laos had also grown quite large. That red dot on your map, that is Dien Bien Phu, is just to the east of a Lao province called Phong Sa-Li, where Pathet Lao fighters, along with the Viet Minh, and in fact the Viet Minh outnumber the Pathet Lao, had organized themselves along the same guerrilla lines that had been organized in northern Vietnam. And in the early 1950s, they were making very serious inroads toward Vientiane. They were able to get down south from their perspective, down to Luang Prabang, and were controlling much of what is the mountainous northeast of Laos. We're not going to talk about the war in Laos, but for much of the war in Laos, this geography here becomes significant. Phong Sa-Li, another province in the northeast, Sam Nha, these provinces matter quite a lot. These provinces become the base of Pathet Lao, and then once it's formed, the Lao People's Party's operations. So the French are trying to cut ties, because what they're actually doing, and the reason we are looking at this map, is we're trying to see how, or illustrate how, the French are fighting not just a war in Vietnam for independence, they are also fighting a largely Viet Minh force in Laos for Lao independence. All of this, the wars for independence across Indochina, come to an end with French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. So now they're in Geneva. After 2 months of negotiations, it was agreed that the country would split at the 17th parallel. Elections would be held in 2 years to create a government that would unite the country once more. So below the 17th parallel, you have South Vietnam. Above it, of course, North Vietnam. The idea is there will be a 2-year waiting period for these two places to sort of reestablish themselves. Then through elections, you will create a coalition government between the government in the south and in the north. Vietnam will be then united under that coalition government. Foreign forces agreed to withdraw, only keeping enough French soldiers in South Vietnam to train a military for national defense. Similar plans for coalition governments were created for Laos and Cambodia. All the participant countries of the Geneva Conference signed these agreements in July 1954, except for one major player, the United States, which condemned the agreements as capitulation to communism, even as it promised to uphold them. At the end of World War II, the U.S. controlled half of the world's manufacturing capacity. Half of the world's electrical power was used in the United States, and half of the world's monetary reserves were held by the United States. By 1948, the U.S. controlled 48% of all world trade. Although it would not be an empire based on formal colonization of overseas territories, U.S. officials after World War II were clear in their objectives to dictate to as much of the world as possible the new terms of this global economy atop which the U.S. sat. In 1948, the U.S. State Department's Director of Policy Planning, George F. Kennan, sort of the brains behind the U.S.'s general Cold War containment policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, George Kennan writes the following. Speaking of maintaining the U.S.'s position in the world, he says, to do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality. We do not need to deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism or world benefaction. For these reasons, we must observe great restraint in our attitude toward the Far Eastern areas. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives, such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. We are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. Our influence in the Far Eastern area in the coming period is going to be primarily military and economic. So you can see the U.S. beginning to think of how it's going to build and defend its empire. But in the late 1940s, after World War II, the building and defending of this empire is largely a matter of maintaining power over Asian archipelagos. For Kennan, effective control over Asia meant control over the archipelagos of Japan and the Philippines. However, the CCP's victory in China in 1949 changed this calculation for many U.S. officials. The U.S. quickly became involved in two wars, as we discussed earlier, on the Asian continent, Korea and Indochina. Kennan vocally opposed U.S. involvement in these conflicts as unwise for the overall plan to contain the Soviet Union and communism, but he was fired from the State Department in 1952 by arch-anti-communist Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. In the coming years, U.S. policymakers came to believe that the spread of communism in mainland Asia would be a direct threat to U.S. dominance over the islands and therefore a threat to U.S. security. Communism in Southeast Asia could block Japanese access to resources like rubber, tin, and oil, which could hurt U.S. efforts to rebuild the Japanese economy to its liking. The U.S. became totally opposed to an electoral reunification of Vietnam and totally opposed to resolution of the civil conflict. Leaked in 1969, the Pentagon Papers noted that agreements for elections in July 1956, according to the Geneva Agreements, were, quote, a major disaster for U.S. interests, end quote. This was largely because as early as August 1954, the CIA began predicting that the Viet Minh would most likely win power in free and fair elections nationally. In his memoir, President Eisenhower estimated that in 1954, and I quote again, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader, end quote. Instead of concerning themselves with the wishes of Vietnamese people, Eisenhower and Dulles were concerned with their domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam became communist, then the rest of Southeast Asia would fall like a line of dominoes you see pictured on the PowerPoint. The power of the U.S. military and economy after World War II made it unthinkable in Washington that America could be defeated by a revolution in a peasant society, and made policy thinkers overly optimistic, to say the least, about the prospect of imposition of U.S. will onto Southeast Asia. The Pentagon Papers revealed that Washington saw South Vietnam in 1954 as, quote, essentially the creation of the United States, end quote. Ngo Dinh Diem's role at the head of the South Vietnamese government was likewise the result of U.S. wishes, and here I quote again at length. You can read along with me. Without U.S. support, Diem almost certainly could not have consolidated his hold on the South during 1955 and 1956. Without the threat of U.S. intervention, South Vietnam could not have refused to even discuss the elections called for in 1956 under the Geneva Settlement without immediately being overrun by the Viet Minh armies. So this assessment by the United States, by the CIA, is probably true. But Diem did have his own vision for the country. He depended on U.S. support to realize anti-communist policies that he held all on his own. The CIA had contacts with the Ngo family before 1954, as I've already said, but it was in that year, 54, that John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, John Foster's brother, began the search for a suitable strongman to lead South Vietnam, setting up CIA stations in Saigon that reported directly to Allen Dulles. By the end of May 1954, the U.S. State Department and the French government had both decided that the most qualified person for leading a non-communist Vietnam would be Diem. In preparing to build the new government, a CIA operative in Saigon drew up a list of conditions, of which he had 6. 1. The U.S. would directly train the South Vietnamese military despite French objections. 2. The new government would uncompromisingly resist any encroachments from the Viet Minh into the South. 3. The new government would continue a war against the Viet Minh. 4. The new government would oppose coalition and partition. 5. The CIA would get direct access to Bao Dai, although that doesn't matter in just a couple of years. And 6. The CIA's role in the new South Vietnamese government would remain a secret. The Ngo family accepted these terms, and Diem accepted Bao Dai's offer to become premier of South Vietnam on June 16, 1954. He arrived in Saigon to assume that office on June 25. Diem's government soon came to rely on the U.S. for its budget. In October 1954, Eisenhower ordered what he called a crash program of military assistance, resulting in the formation of the U.S. Military Advisory Group in February 1955. Between 1954 and 1960, the U.S. gave Diem's government $444 million in military aid and $1.4 billion with a B dollars in economic aid. The Vietnamese National Army became completely dependent on the U.S. for its survival. In October 1955, Diem rigged a fraudulent referendum against Emperor Bao Dai, who was at the time still living in France. Based on these fraudulent results, Diem replaced Bao Dai as the chief of state in southern Vietnam and proclaimed the Republic of Vietnam. In your PowerPoints here, it is RVN, not ARVN. In this new position, he was both head of the government of Vietnam and head of a newly renamed military, which is ARVN, ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Although Southern communists had largely been disarmed, they were still a powerful political force. U.S. intelligence agencies continued to predict landslide victories for the communists if free elections were held. In total opposition to the Geneva Agreements, but supported by the CIA and the U.S. State Department, Diem refused to hold any discussions about national elections that were due to be held in July 1956, according to those Geneva Agreements. He also denied elections in South Vietnam, which meant no Vietnamese in the North or in the South enjoyed the right to vote. In the South, elections were abolished all the way down to the village council leadership levels. So instead, Diem's government, instead of having these elected village leaders, what Diem's government did was they appointed unelected committees to run each village. As the government replaced the older military leadership with new appointees from Diem, appointed provincial leaders then slowly became these same appointed military officers, all of whom are loyal to and willing to act on Diem's, what we will see are brutal authoritarian orders. In August 1956, Diem cemented his power with Ordinance 47, which issued a death sentence for anyone accused by the government of collaborating with communists. You can imagine in a very corrupt atmosphere that accusation becomes very easy to make. Finally, Diem worked to undo the highly popular land reform that the Viet Minh conducted during the war. He took land from peasants and returned it to its original landowners. In many cases, peasants were even forced to pay back rents for their use of the land. Diem then launched his own reforms that left land belonging to the Catholic Church, French citizens, and absentee landlords completely untouched. So all these places got to keep their land. In the Mekong Delta, 80% of farmers were landless tenants. Only 10% of these benefited from Diem's reforms. By 1961, 40% of Cochinchina's peasants were still landless. Only 22% of all farmers owned the land that they farmed. The rest were paying, incredibly high rents. All of this was a recipe for deep dislike of Diem's government in the South, and it also created a strong affinity for the Viet Minh, who had conducted such popular land reform that Diem was now undoing. Diem's authoritarianism even caused problems within his own ranks. In October 1960, 3 ARVN paratrooper battalions staged a failed coup in Saigon. The battle killed 400 people before Diem was able to regain control. This was fruitful ground for the communist insurgency, growing very strong in the southern countryside. To understand the dynamics of the communist response, it's important to understand the relative separation of the northern and southern movements. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, since the Geneva Agreements, is its own state in its own country. Its government was responsible for trying to realize the Vietnam-wide elections called for by the Geneva Agreements, and it was also responsible for providing support to underground communists in the South. So it's got this political resolution, and it also, through the elections, and it also has to support what is quickly becoming an insurgency in the South. However, it also had all the problems that any new government had. It needed to begin building infrastructure, it needed to begin developing industry, it needed to begin boosting agricultural production, and so it's got a lot of tasks on its hands. It's fighting different kinds of battles on different kinds of fronts. It has all these matters of state that it has to consider. In short, it had a state to run in addition to dealing with South Vietnam. Now, Southern communists are a little bit different. The situation is different. They did not have the responsibilities of governance, but they did have to find ways to survive and fight back against bloody repression from Diem's government. So because of this, Southern communists, most notably for us, a man named Le Duan, pictured here, were in favor of a return to armed revolution years before the DRV agreed that such a return was necessary. The slow turn to armed revolution in the South began in 1956 when Le Duan, VWP Secretary for Cochinchina, began simultaneously advocating for peaceful political struggle and the need to begin preparing armed units. Specifically, armed units, at least in the beginning, as self-defense squads for political units, people who are doing things like peasant organizing, labor organizing, that sort of thing. Clashes slowly mounted, beginning in October 1957, and increasing in 58 and eventually 59. The Southern communists were losing this fight. VWP membership in the South decreased from 15,000 in 1957 to probably only 5,000 in 1959. In 1957, Le Duan was brought to Hanoi and named the Vietnamese Workers' Party's acting Secretary General. This put an understandably more radical Southern communist near the top of party leadership. In January 1959, the VWP Central Committee held its 15th plenum in Hanoi. The major debate that went on largely between Southern and Northern members of the VWP was whether the revolution should return to armed struggle or not. So after long debate, the VWP Central Committee finally passed what it called Resolution 15. It's a fantastically important document in this history because it marks the official return to armed struggle for the Vietnamese Workers' Party as a whole. They promoted insurrection in the South while saying that that armed struggle should be paired with, although less important now, political struggle. The use of violence, however, was still supposed to be limited to self-defense, largely self-defense for these political units. Still, Hanoi was not ready then to launch a people's war, not in 1959. In May 59, Hanoi also formed what it called Group 559, which would later become the organization that opened the Ho Chi Minh Trail through southern Laos. Hanoi's moderation on the issue of armed struggle couldn't hold back civil war in South Vietnam. By May 1959, the insurrection in the South had already begun, fueled by a need to fight back against Diem's repression. By 1963, communist rebels had killed or kidnapped 13,000 officials from Diem's government. Total communist losses between January 1957 and June 1962 were as high as 79,000. Meanwhile, during the same period, South Vietnamese losses, the losses to the government of the Republic of Vietnam, totaled roughly 35,000 people. At the same time, only 20 Americans were killed. In December 1960, the Communists established the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, better known as, in some circles, the NLF, National Liberation Front, and what I will be referring to here, because you've heard of it before, the Viet Cong. At its founding, the Viet Cong had roughly 37,500 members. Many different groups, like certain Cao Dai sects, joined the Viet Cong, but the key figure until 1965 was the head of the VWP's Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, Nguyen Van Linh. Diem's repression became the Viet Cong's most powerful recruitment tool. By 1961, the Diem government estimated that it no longer controlled half the population of South Vietnam. That same year, the CIA and ARVN began launching black entry military operations against North Vietnam. Washington also increased the number of military advisors from 685 to 3,000. By the end of 1963, 16,000 U.S. military personnel were deployed in Vietnam. Although the conflict was still a South Vietnamese civil war, America was now playing a direct role, flying hundreds and later thousands of attack sorties over the countryside and spraying herbicides over the jungles, hoping to reveal insurgents. Washington's insistence on finding a ruthless strongman to pacify Vietnam was backfiring. So as I've already mentioned earlier, the situation in the North was very different from the situation in the South. In the North, the DRV was able to complete its land reform campaign by July 1956. The campaign unfolded through two major processes. One of them is about actually reforming land ownership. The other is about changing the makeup of the party itself, having a party purge. The reform process itself, then, this unfolded in two steps. First, there would be what the VWP called mass mobilization through rent reduction. You would go into an area through intimidation and negotiation. You would have landlords, rich peasants, agree to lower rents. These rents would have been paid as not cash, but a portion of the crop that the peasants were able to harvest. Rent reduction in most communist movements tends to be a fairly moderate affair, although physical intimidation is present and some landlords do get severely injured or occasionally killed. Then the party moved on to the more violent aspect, the actual redistribution campaign. It is in land redistribution that you get the stripping of land from landlords, rich peasants, and in many cases, when the campaign reaches its excesses, stripping of land from middle peasants as well. All of this is then given to poor peasants and landless farmers, and it is in that point that you get modeled on Chinese Communist Party methods. You get public rallies denouncing landlords, you get assassinations of landlords, public executions, and that sort of thing. So the second phase of that gets fairly violent. Now, the political process, the second phase of the larger change. The political process, this is a purge of landlords and other class enemies from the VWP's ranks. By 1953, the VWP's lower ranks were mostly made up of middle peasants with some landlords and rich peasants. Poor peasants were there, but they were a very small segment of the VWP's overall organization, and VWP leadership wanted to correct that. Both processes, actual land reform and the purge, were more or less successful. By 1957, poor peasants and landless laborers held 3 to 5 times more land than they had held in 1953, according to official party figures. And likewise, in VWP village communities, poor peasants and landless laborer membership in the party increased from 4 to 53%. But as you can imagine, this was not at all a peaceful process, this purge. Thousands of landlords and rich peasants were killed during both phases of the campaign. The total number killed is unknown, of course, but the reading for this week estimates the figure to be between 3,000 and 15,000. The campaign came to a close in 1956 when Ho Chi Minh and other top VWP officials began publishing statements condemning the excesses of the campaign, condemning the violence. Several top leaders who oversaw the land reform campaign resigned, and on November 8, 1956, Ho abolished land reform tribunals, ending the hunt for landlords. In December, 12,000 prisoners detained during the campaign were released. The architects of land reform who stepped down were replaced in part by Le Duan and his Southern Communist associates. Thus, the VWP's attempt to dial back its radicalism in relation to the land reform campaign actually paved the way for further radicalism through increased influence of communists from southern Vietnam. In the first years of the new country, the DRV's economy did actually fairly well. Between 1954 and 1959, rice production doubled from 2.55 to 5.19 million tons of rice per year. These yields were far larger than anything the French colonial administration could produce. The increase came from 2 sources. 1, new land was brought under cultivation by the party, and 2, the improved productivity of land that was already being farmed. In 1958, the VWP began collectivizing land holdings in a process that was much less violent than the 54 to 56 land reform campaign. By 1960, 85% of North Vietnam's farms belonged to low-level farming cooperatives. In economic terms, the results of the collectivization aspects of VWP economic planning were not that good. Collectivization didn't result in famine, as it did in China during the same period, but production levels did suffer. And after the collectivization process, it took a full 15 years for the new cooperatives and collectives to match the annual yield high of 1959. In 1963, many members of the Buddhist clergy began protesting the Diem regime. On June 11, pictured on the bottom right of the slide, a monk named Thich Quang Duc brought the conflicts in South Vietnam to the world's attention by calmly burning himself alive in a public street in Saigon. In August, there were 4 more public self-immolations. ARVN troops, in response, invaded 12 pagodas, arresting hundreds. It was a sign that Diem was failing in his CIA-given task to build a strong anti-communist South Vietnam. With CIA approval, ARVN officials launched a coup on November 2, 1963, assassinating Diem, pictured top right, and his brother Nhu. A third Ngo brother was executed the following year. As General Duong Van Minh, nicknamed Big Min, took power, the CIA began its second attempt to use authoritarianism to build a strong anti-communist state. The communists in the North and South were watching. 1 month after Diem's assassination, the VWP Central Committee resolved that the conflict in Vietnam was now primarily an armed conflict, not a political struggle. Hanoi announced its support for a people's war in the South. By this point, Le Duan's influence over the VWP had grown considerably. He was able to advocate for more militant positions on the war in the South and institute a round of purges of party members in the North who questioned the turn to armed revolution. He was even able to criticize Ho Chi Minh for capitulating to the French in 1945 and 1954. Ho, who was by this point very old and in declining health, could not muster much of a resistance. The next escalation in the war came in August 1964 as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The CIA had long been working with South Vietnamese forces to attack points along the DRV coast. One night in August, a U.S. and a DRV ship sailed within range of one another in the Gulf of Tonkin. The U.S. ship misinterpreted an unknown reading on its radar, at which it fired several missiles. The blip on the radar was nothing, and no one on either side was hurt. Nonetheless, President Lyndon Johnson used the event to demonstrate DRV aggression to Congress and gain permission for an air war directly against North Vietnam. The U.S. began a savage bombing campaign against the North and in Laos over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. During Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965-68, an average of 800 tons of U.S. bombs were dropped on North Vietnam every day. From 1964 to 1972, over 1 million U.S. bombs were dropped, destroying most major northern cities. 500 U.S. pilots were shot down and captured. Even more havoc was wreaked on Laos. From 1964 to 73, the U.S. dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, trying to eradicate Lao communists in the north while just trying to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the south. In March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops finally landed in Da Nang, while the air war in the south escalated. By 1973, U.S. forces had dropped 4 million tons of bombs, 400,000 tons of napalm, and 19 million gallons of herbicide on South Vietnam's rural areas trying to defeat the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. Still, ground troops found much of South Vietnam under Viet Cong control. As with the Diem regime, U.S. violence and the violence of later governmental leaders in South Vietnam continually increased support for the Viet Cong. Washington and Saigon faced an enemy that got ready and willing support from local people and thus needed little aid from Hanoi. From 1965 onward, although U.S. military presence in South Vietnam far outweighed PAVN presence in South Vietnam, Washington faced an issue the French faced in 1946. How do you win against an almost complete communist takeover in the countryside? Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. On the evening of January 30th, 1968, during Tet, 80,000 communist troops, 75% of them Viet Cong, so 75% of them part of the National Liberation Front in the South, stormed more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. There were also attacks on major air bases, military garrisons, and hundreds of village centers. The Tet Offensive was an almost total surprise to Washington and Saigon. Vietnamese fighters even briefly took control of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and occupied Hue for 4 weeks. Over the coming weeks, 40,000 Viet Cong soldiers were killed in what ultimately became a massive military defeat. Despite U.S. and South Vietnamese victory, however, in this particular campaign, most foreign observers began to realize that this was the beginning of the end of the war. The impact on Vietnamese civilians was enormous. Over 1 million in South Vietnam lost their homes. As communist forces retreated from Hue, they assassinated thousands of South Vietnamese officials and supporters. The surprise of the Tet Offensive also changed the dynamic between U.S. soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. U.S. soldiers now distrusted the Vietnamese people around them, believing that anyone now could be a secret communist spy. Such distrust and anger from U.S. troops led to the deadliest attack by U.S. soldiers on Vietnamese civilians in the history of the war in March 1968, the My Lai Massacre, in which American troops slaughtered an entire village of roughly 500 people. one aspect of the Vietnam War that set it apart from previous wars in the United States history was its incredible mass media coverage, its incredible journalistic coverage. Never before had so many reporters been embedded with U.S. troops. Never before so many photographers. Never before the ability to televise parts of the war. And so we can, and we probably should, look at some of the photographs from the My Lai massacre, just to take in ways that I would not be able to describe to you in words, the amount of violence that came with U.S. excesses and U.S. distrust of the Vietnamese once they believed that any Vietnamese person could be a spy. So in the top left, and these are all available on the Wikipedia. Top left, we have father and son murdered on the side of the road by U.S. soldiers. In the bottom left, we have a pile of dead bodies along a road headed into My Lai, also murdered by by American soldiers. Finally, the picture on the right, if you see to the right, the woman in black holding her child. According to sources at the time, immediately that woman adjusting her shirt, you can see, is adjusting her shirt in the wake of an attempted sexual assault. And according to journalistic reports live on the scene, taking this photo, for example, everyone in this photo was gunned down immediately after it was taken by American forces. Next, and I don't mean to place the destruction of property above the loss of life, but I wanted to drive home, since we've already discussed earlier in the semester the brutality of Japan's war against China during the Second World War. My Lai also, and many other places, involved American soldiers burning villages down, burning them to the ground. So if in Japan we got the three alls policy of absolute total destruction, here in Vietnam we see with American forces something very similar comes up. You have a guerrilla force that you're fighting. You cannot tell who is with them, who is against them. The answer becomes, well, just kill everyone and destroy everything that they own. That is both ineffective in terms of fighting the guerrilla force and decreasing their numbers, and it is ineffective if what you are trying to do is to get people in the surrounding area on your side. So after the Tet Offensive, when 68 becomes far and away the most violent year of the war, you can start to see the dynamic behind that. So let us then continue looking at American excesses. The head of U.S. military command in South Vietnam was a man named William Westmoreland. And following U.S. and South Vietnamese victories after the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland asked President Lyndon Johnson for 206,000 additional troops to secure the positions that they had gained. Johnson, however, refused. By 68, American willingness to fight this war is waning. They've been losing it from the beginning, and Americans are starting to realize that. And of course, especially as this level of violence, knowledge of this level of violence turns home, Americans get a very serious distaste for the war. Johnson also suspended, during his presidency, the bombing campaign that he had begun in North Vietnam. Nonetheless, as I said, 1968 winds up being the bloodiest year of the conflict, as American troops and Vietnamese communists increased in their clashes, and American willingness to wipe out all Vietnamese in a given area for the sake of killing a few communists increased. From December 1968 to May 1969, for example, during Operation Speedy Express, American forces claimed to have killed 10,000 enemies. Yet, recovered from those 10,000 enemies only 748 weapons at a cost of 267 American lives. That number of weapons recovered is incredibly suspicious for killing so many enemies. Eyebrows were raised. As the 9th Infantry Division commander explained, to quote him, Viet Cong units dispersed and blended very effectively with people in the numerous villages and hamlets, greatly complicating reconnaissance difficulties and problems of fire control. Later U.S.-led investigations concluded that the 9th Infantry Division had killed at minimum 5,000 Vietnamese civilians during Operation Speedy Express. American political scientists later estimated that between 1965 and 1972, the U.S. and the government of South Vietnam together killed 475,000 civilians through starvation, exposure, execution, massacre, bombing, shelling, or just plain old murder. Similar studies found that the communists killed between 27 and 36,000 civilians and abducted somewhere between 40 and 60,000. Both sides, then, let me be clear, are guilty of war crimes. Let me say it again because I will be accused of being too hard on the West and too soft on the communists. Both sides are guilty of atrocious war crimes. But the numbers, I think, here speak for themselves in terms of who was responsible for the largest loss of life in Vietnam. And the party responsible for the largest loss of life in Vietnam is an invading imperialist force. So how does it end? In 1972, a Pavan offensive led to communist seizure of roughly half of the country. In Washington, the Nixon administration recommenced bombing of the North, escalating the level of destruction over time. The U.S. also then began mining North Vietnamese harbors and instituted a coastal blockade. This kind of offensive, however, was only one wing of Nixon's plan to get out of the war. He also, very famously, in February 1972, visited Shanghai and met with Chinese Communist Party leaders, a meeting that was paved for him through the work of Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in China. And he met with them specifically to discuss two issues. What are we going to do about Taiwan? What are we going to do about Vietnam? You will see on the PowerPoint slide I have in quotations, Taiwan equals Vietnam equals trade-off. That is taken from one of Nixon's handwritten notes, I believe, if I'm not wrong, on the plane on the way over to Shanghai. The idea was the United States would back off recognition of Taiwan, would back off military defense of Taiwan, if China would back off support for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and would allow the United States to back out gracefully. China was more than willing to agree to this because, for reasons we don't have time to go into here, by 1972, the Sino-Soviet split had reached a point that there had already been border clashes between China and the Soviet Union in the north, and Chinese leaders were coming to see the Soviets as a larger threat to their own national security than the United States. So that's step one, is a diplomatic retreat, making sure that Vietnam will not have Chinese support and that the U.S. will be able to leave with a little bit of its dignity intact, although I think they failed at that. Now, the second wing of this sort of withdrawal, the second wing of Nixon's end to the war, is Operation Linebacker. So in October 1972, Operation Linebacker saw American planes fly 42 sorties over the DRV, dropping 155,000 tons of bombs. Meanwhile, peace talks in Paris, which had begun under the Johnson administration, were making progress, and these are perhaps the third phase of this withdrawal. The U.S. was no longer demanding Pavan withdrawal from the South, and now agreed to limit its rearmament of the South Vietnamese military once a ceasefire was reached. In return, the DRV dropped its insistence on the removal from office of President and military strongman Nguyen Vinh Thieu. Nixon suspended bombing north of the 20th parallel, and peace seemed to be within reach. President Thieu, however, opposed the agreement, and U.S. bombing resumed in December 1972. When talks resumed the following January, so we're in 1973, the DRV agreed to a ceasefire and to return its 566 American prisoners of war in exchange for U.S. withdrawal from the South. The Paris Agreement ended the U.S. combat role in the war, but the ceasefire was never realized. President Thieu stayed in power as the Civil War raged on. By early 1975, communist forces began capturing provincial capitals along the Cambodian border. As the year wore on, the government of South Vietnam began to turn on its own supporter groups as ARVN slowly collapsed. First, communist forces captured Hue, then on March 30, they captured Da Nang, and finally on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into and captured Saigon. So let's talk about the costs. It is still the case that in Laos, which holds the horrible distinction of being the most bombed country in human history, unexploded U.S. ordnance from this war still goes off in 2022. If you see the picture here on the slide, these children in Vietnam, this picture was taken in 2014, and these children are born still with various kinds of disabilities, various kinds of deformities, as a result of that herbicide I've mentioned several times in this lecture, Agent Orange. So the impacts are still felt today. And if you travel to Vietnam, it is unavoidable. It is in your face in every major city, the costs of the war. And I do not mean through state propaganda. I mean in the mutilated bodies of older people, in the deformities such as you see pictured here. You cannot miss it. The official CIA history argues that North Vietnamese victory was set in motion from the very beginning. They argue that their decision to back Diem, whose brutal authoritarianism did nothing but begin a process of severe alienation of the peasantry from the South Vietnamese government, set in motion a relationship between the people and the state in the Republic of Vietnam that could not be repaired, and created then a bottomless well of support for the Viet Cong and support for the Vietnamese Workers' Party. In the end, Washington's $150 billion investment since 1965 was a complete failure. Over the course of 3 decades, from 1945 to 1975, communist leadership and a broad peasant movement was able to defeat not only French colonialism, but also U.S. imperialism. Although the majority of deaths were at the hands of the Japanese before 45, French and U.S. forces, war crimes were, as I've tried to be clear, committed on both sides. In the famine caused by the Japanese in 1944 and 45, 1 million Vietnamese people died. In the wars fought against the French and America after 1945, another 3 million Vietnamese people died. And in the end, the lessons that were learned were just lessons about the limits of first Japanese, then French, then U.S. imperial control and their ability to dictate to the world what that world should look like. That's it, and I will see you next time.